Good evening, everyone. So yeah, as you heard, my name is Olivia. I will be animating or hosting this conversation, but as we discussed before, we will very much have a conversation that goes in any direction. So you can ask each other questions. I will ask you questions, and you can ask me questions as well. But also, I want to alert you in the audience that there will be a formal Q&A part at some point, depending on how much you chip in the meantime. But we also might take some time somewhere in the middle, or if you have a burning question, just feel free to raise your hand so that we kind of have also a conversation more broadly with you, not just at the very end. We thought we had a lot of time. It was like scheduled for 2 hours. We'll see how long it is, but usually it doesn't feel that long. So we'll see how far it goes. So as I said, conversation, there will also be some readings, bits from and performance from the book or from other readings. So yeah, I would say just, I wanted to say sit back, relax, and enjoy the evening. The topics are not going to be super light. So the extent to which we can do that, we'll see. But I think it will be quite meaningful. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to foreground the more. I think it's important for us to have informal conversations about this, right? Because we need a lot of space to think through some of this. And so the way I wanted to start was with the title. The title is Deigo Garcia, and I will invite either of you to just briefly hint at what this refers to for people who haven't had the chance to read your book yet. But also, I already wanted to signal the book is about much more than that. And so the rest of the conversation will try to put these things together. But so when we say Deigo Garcia, and I'll have my story about how I got to know about this, but how would you introduce this to an audience, the connection to the topics, but also, yeah, what events or historical events does this refer to? Sure.
Go for it. Okay. Thank you, Olivia. Deigo Garcia is the name of the largest island in the Chagos archipelago, which is a group of islands in the Indian Ocean. It's also home to an American military base. The Chagos Islands are currently illegally controlled by the British government. The Chagos Islands are the home of the dispossessed Chagosian people who were forcibly evicted from these islands between 1968 and 1973 by the British government in collusion with the US government to facilitate the building of this space. And there is more to say about this in terms of the country of Mauritius claimed sovereignty over the islands, and in fact the International Court of Justice found in favour of Mauritius's claim to the islands. Mauritius was formerly a colony of Britain and was given independence in a sense in exchange for the Chagos Islands, which is illegal. It's partial decolonisation, and that was an illegal move. But the Chagosian people, the Chagos Islands are their homeland.
Mm-hmm. And so the way I learned about this, and that's also why I was like generally excited to be able to read the book, but also to have this conversation. So I'm supposedly an international relations scholar, and my interest has been about international solidarity when we take colonialism seriously, right? And so then trying to think about aid and development just becomes a bit obscene because you can't really go and help someone after you broke them blind and all of that. And so I had one of my professors, is a friend and a mentor. His name is Tiba Grobogi. And he's a person who knows all the details of anything that ever happened in the world, the type of academic that. And so at some point I was explaining my project, it's about, trying to think anti-colonial solidarity, and he's like, okay, do you know about the Chagos Island? And I'm like, no, but so he made me look it up there. And this is just in the year 2019, right? Like it feels like yesterday. And it's also something I wanted to also bring up in terms of there's so much we don't know, but then again, and the thing that struck me in how he told the story is like there is a group of people on this planet at the end of so-called formal colonization. So you have the 60s when everybody's decolonizing everything, people living on the land, and they are being told, pack up everything, including your goats and your chickens. because you have to leave the land, right? And so I was, and then this year I started to include this example in my teaching at the LSE. And again, like everybody in the classroom as well, nobody has heard about this. And so I think my question also for us, maybe to extend the great introductions that we had, how do you personally relate to this story? How did it end up in a book, but also how did it end up in a book that you then decide to write together, or was this decision before? So if you can, just maybe, signal how can we have this amazing book, and how do you relate personally to that?
I wondered if I could just add something really important that I missed from, well, I didn't get to this part of the story yet, but in terms of the Chagosian people, and I'm a bit quiet.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that is really kind of central to this story of dispossession is the continued struggle and resistance that the Chagosian people have demonstrated in fighting for their right to return, and that the ICJ case came to court is because of the continued work that the Chagosians have been doing under the leadership of Olivia Umurerwa, leader of the CRG. But in terms of how we came to the story, I have a lot to say, but I feel like I've been talking a lot already. Okay, all right. Well, I am not Chagosian. I'm of Mauritian heritage. I was born in the UK to Mauritian parents, but my dad was for many years in the British Air Force and was stationed at a base in the Maldives, which was closed in the 70s this Air Force base in Deigo Garcia being opened. So I knew this story. I knew this story as part of Mauritian history, and I knew this story because of the British military aspect. But I'm glad, Olivia, that you brought up this issue of not having encountered this story before, despite your wide knowledge and your studies and your kind of focus and your political focus. And I was struck, and Luke was struck as well, how we were encountering people who didn't know, people outside the Chagosian community who didn't know about this story, and so how to then help support, do the work of circulating this and highlighting this without speaking for, claiming to speak for or speak over the Chagosian people that continue working as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything both of you have said. I think maybe only to add is one of the reasons I think why Natasha and I became particularly interested in the story of Deigo Garcia and Chagos was just the remarkable fact that, as Olivia said, in the age of decolonialism in the 60s, a brand new colony was created by the British called Biot of these islands, this archipelago, specifically in order to facilitate this military base. And just that very fact took us a long time to get our heads around. When I studied history at university and a lot of colonial history, and I was never told this. I was told like empire, the age of empire is kind of over, and actually I kind of thought that for a while, and I think over the years I've had a gradual realization that the age of empire isn't over. If you think of colonialism or imperialism as a type of knowledge, as well as a physical taking over or occupying of land, but the fact that the Biot, the Chagos Archipelago is a literal colony that was created in the 60s is just a fact that resonates hugely for me. And I think the other, maybe one more reason, I mean, there's probably a lot more, but I really like what you said about how Deigo Garcia is a literal place, but I also think it came to signify a huge number of things for Natasha and I the more we researched it. And I'm sure, well, I guess there's writers and scholars in the room, but I think, if you find somewhere that where everything you read somehow seems to be located, or it's like a kind of like the white whale for us, where everything just seemed to come down to Deigo Garcia, from the kind of military industrial complex, colonialism in the current era, that the refugee crisis. There's incredible stories, harrowing stories about the way that Chagosians have been treated by the Home Office and the hostile environment, families split up and so on. Everything's just seemed to revolve around this, and I think when that happens, I want to write about it, just. Oh, no, yeah.
One of the really resonant aspects of the story, the Chagosian story, is this concept of Sagran, which is specific to the Chagosian experience, but has resonances in other communities. And Sagran is a Chagosian word for sadness, which relates to a kind of existential soul death that leads to literal death. I don't know how else to describe it.
It's specifically related to being removed from your home.
Yes, yeah, and being dispossessed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt there were so many, as you said, so many themes that come up, but also one of the reasons that, for instance, I bring it in the classroom is not like, oh, let me show you something you didn't know about. I know we're supposed to organize our classrooms like that, but it was more to indeed speak to this these colonial practices that are being reproduced constantly everywhere, right? And because one thing that just came to my mind was this fact that we can just say American military bases, but it's also a place where torture happens, let's say in the whole context of war and terror. But it's a specific legal place even where all the laws that we have doesn't apply. And so these modes of exception, again, like when we start thinking about that, they happen all the time, they reproduce all the time. And at the same time, we have these ideas about our countries as well-intended, and then sometimes it goes wrong or something like that. And that's how we try and think about solidarity. So I know we will come back to how it connects in terms of the many different things, but I wanted to invite you, Natasha, to, we looked at the title, but then the beginning of the book actually, I think, helps us understand how you two managed to weave this story, because we set the scene now for a very, I don't know, macro, international politics, whatever kind of approach to this. But the book actually does so much more to talk about these themes. So let me not talk for you, but I want to invite you to read us the opening.
Thank you. So the opening chapter is called Debt, and it's from a section of the book called Daniel and Deigo. Chapter 1, Debt. This is the story of a book we are still writing. Edinburgh, July 2014. The sluggishness of early afternoon, the sky clouding over, a slight chill in the air. The same uninterrupted sadness, a kind of listlessness that went with everything we did. We'd made it to the meadows. It had taken us a while to get out of the flat, him offering to buy us a coffee from the Swedish cafe and one of those cardamom buns we liked so much if she would come to the library. We noticed how people passing noticed one another. She noticed how much thinner he was than in London, joggers slipping down on his hips. We slowed our pace. We were still talking about the morning, as if something out of the ordinary had happened, when really we'd spent it the way we spent every morning. Him coming to her room with coffee, her accusing him of switching the heating off, him denying this. He told her, we really must get up earlier. It won't help to stay in bed. This because we sometimes spent entire days in our beds. In the kitchen, she lit a tube, picked the raisins out of his cereal, milk still unpoured, put them with the other raisins extracted from other breakfasts. Currency, she said. They'll see us through the emergency. He ate. We stared at his open screen. We argued about whether to cycle to the library. but the sky seemed unsettled and unusually close from up here on the 6th floor. We decided to walk. The billboard above Scotland still read straight talking money, Wonga. In the meadows, some kind of fair, tabletop stalls and food tents. Let's mill, she said. He began to look for something, a set of Encyclopedia Britannica 1911. He was always looking for a set of Encyclopedia Britannica 1911. By the time we met again, the rain was falling. She took him to a stall and said, I'm buying this dress. Is that a dress? Yes, she said. She paid and disappeared with the dress, made of material with some kind of special effect, like oil on water. When she came back, she had it on over her jeans and raincoat. Just imagine, there are whole loads of famous people who were never photographed, she said. He thought about this. She thought, he looks like a young Nosferatu, Max Schreck. He would not know which screen starter likened me to, because he's learned about these things. A fine rain, dim light through the cherry trees. We walked away from the fair, not speaking, and when we reached the part of the meadows that opens onto the tennis courts, we turned up onto Middle Meadow Walk, ignoring the unbroken row of posters, comedy acts appearing next month at the festival, not ready to stop, not ready for a coffee or a bun or the library. We took flight at the traffic lights and cut through Bristow Square. After that, letting ourselves be carried by chance. And the sadness opened out. The city is built on several hills. There are valleys and there are bridges and there are stairwells that connect the two. In those days, we would stop on one or another of the bridges and lean over to observe the streets. Sometimes we watched the gardens, but never the rail tracks. It was frightening and thrilling to come upon these sudden and dramatic views, which made us think of the postcards sold everywhere on the Royal Mile, and all over the city for that matter. The old town and the grass market, Hellgate at night, Princess Street Gardens, Princess Street, looking west. We would stand there looking down, but she didn't say what she would have said before. We're too fucking scared to jump. Because when we walked, we failed to take in our surroundings. And because when we stopped walking, we usually stopped on one of the bridges and looked down, we always had the sense of living above the city, of looking down dizzy on its many faces. We watched people flowing past as though caught in a flood. Knowing the city this way from above, having arrived only recently, we didn't feel part of it, though it had once been part of him. We were nervous and irritable. This seemed to increase our togetherness. It gave us, only us together, not individually, never alone, a place in the world that we would not have had before. We wandered the streets unwelcome, leaning miserably into the wind or drinking ourselves stupid in a pub. All of this under the ugly, heart-obscured sky that we didn't realise we'd invented ourselves.
So I would like for us to take some time to think about some of the form, register, novel choices we made in this book. And I want to tie already, I think, a little bit to what we just said, but also what we will also continue to discuss, right? Like, how do we bridge a conversation about both form and content, politics, and all of that? And so it's a very, very brief sentence from spending Facebook, exterminate all the brutes. And he starts and ends the book with that. And he says this, you already know enough. So do I. It's not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. And I'm sharing this because I wanted to ask you about how, I mean, it's a bit weird to read this because we're talking about a story that most of us don't know, right? So there is a contradiction there. But what I've been struck with is that often then when we do know, you know, all the horrors in the world that we see today, think of Palestine, Sudan, the Congo, anything that came before, but it doesn't necessarily seem that knowing facts invites us to do something else or to change stuff. And so I wanted to ask you, maybe immediately in a quite political way, about your stylistic, narrative, literary choices that you made. You can also just say like, no, it just looked nice, whatever. That's also fine, right? But if I maybe can invite you first to just maybe signal also to the audience, what are the different approaches or registers, or because the book is not linear in the sense that it's not the same in every part or something like that, right? And then we'll take from there. But whomever wants to, maybe I'll go to you. How did you end up with this format? It's a blue book. Maybe you also want to say something about that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in your question.
I'll
try not take up too much time in my answer. I mean, I think if we're thinking about connecting the dots, I suppose, which is part of your question. I mean, we looked and were inspired by lots of scholars and traditions, but I think particularly the Black radical tradition coming through America was, inspiring for us for lots of reasons. Partly for what it says they talk about in terms of the individual and collaboration, and how we perhaps negotiate between individuality and the collective. And
The pragmatic.
yeah, we can perhaps talk about Fred Moulton. Not perhaps, we should talk about Fred Moulton.
Just the opening quote.
So I mean, it kind of runs through a lot of our decisions and inspirations in the book. But I think also, perhaps to speak most directly to your question, there was a quote by Cedric Robinson that we had a lot in our mind from his book, Black Marxism. I think it's from that book, where he kind of talks about capitalism. And if we're thinking about perhaps what connecting up knowledge is, or what we know, but how it can perhaps impact everybody, we can't not talk about capitalism. And he talks about capitalism as being characterized by a kind of chaos that cannot be contained in a unifying language. So somehow, to use a unifying language or a smooth narrative arc or a single story, let's say, didn't feel adequate to the material, to the island, and to the stories that we were encountering, but also, frankly, to our own experience, our collective experience as people who have been friends for decades and lived together for some of that, but also our individual experiences. We come from very different backgrounds. So I think right from the beginning, we knew it was going to be a book of fragments, a book that didn't have a unified language, but brought in lots of different languages, not unlike an encyclopedia does, but not perhaps working against perhaps the encyclopedic tradition, certainly in 1911, to try and encompass all of the world's knowledge in one book, which is completely not possible, despite the claims at the time, and not. But there's a certain idea of connecting up by thinking about the fragment and language. Perhaps I'll stop there. There's for sure more to say. Do you have anything to add?
I was just thinking of this is a side note, but the British Library. When we started to go into the British Library, the kind of branding name, the tagline was something like "All the world's knowledge," and which seems incredible now, but obviously we've realised, and now it's something along the lines of "It's all yours."
You can get into the
exactly. But that's an incredibly rich question, which I think could see us through the whole evening and beyond. I think, Olivia, but there are things in there that maybe we could draw out as you invite us to do. And one of the things that perhaps we could look at is this idea of thank you. Fiction, the fact that it's a blue book and not a white book. It's published in the UK by Fitzcarraldo Editions, which, for anyone who's familiar with the publishing project in Fitzcarraldo, all the jacket covers are uniform. There are no images. Books are either produced as in blue if they are fiction, and white if they are non-fiction. And when Luke and I felt this urgency to write about Deigo Garcia and to circulate the story of the struggle of the Chagosian people. We thought, well, this, what are the ethics of making this? Because we trained as novelists. We studied creative writing together. We did an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia with W.G. Sebolt, who was, I think, somebody that we were kind of maybe at first in dialogue with, and then perhaps in resistance to, but certainly writing around the work and the historical project in some way. But yeah, and for anyone familiar with W.G. Sebolt's books, I'm not sure how they are marketed now, but certainly when they first were published, there was this whole kind of mystique around the fact that where would you find, which shelf would it be in? Would it be in biography or history or memoir? But when we were thinking and talking through this together, Luke and I kept coming back, and in fact, we're possibly even motivated to write the book the way we did, I think was the case, because when I recounted earlier how the British and the American governments had been in collusion to dispossess the Chagosians of these islands to make them military based, what emerged during the diligent case, the work of the Chagosians legal team, was the fact that there were these memos in which, I'm a bit foggy in the head because of hay fever or something, so I'm not sure I'm going to remember it, but the diplomats involved actually used the term fiction in that. Maybe you can.
Yeah, so there was a series of memos between American and UK, I guess, diplomats, civil servants is probably the right word, where in order to try and, I guess, hoodwink the international community, particularly the UN, who by that time, during the era of decolonisation, had made it incumbent and in fact illegal to excise portions of land. In the process of decolonisation, the British and American had to create the subterfuge that the people who happened to be,
and also to send people into exile.
Also,
that was the key thing.
Yeah. Both were illegal. Yeah. They had to create this lie that the people who had lived on the Chagos Islands for generations and generations were an itinerant population, basically just some workers that happened to be working on coconut plantations. Anyway, so they created this.
In fact, the descendants of the enslaved people who had been brought there by the French colonisers of Mauritius to work on the plantations.
So in one of these memos, in that kind of chummy language that particularly the British colonial civil servants used, they said, well, we've got to kind of create the fiction that these people are not a normal, a permanent population. And the American civil servant wrote back, no, we must not just create the fiction, we must maintain the fiction.
It's the other way around.
The other way around.
Yeah, we must create the fiction that these islands were
uninhabited.
Yeah, uninhabited.
So we were kind of thinking of that fiction was a key component in this deracination, this horrific act. But what does that then, might we recuperate fiction and somehow to kind of speak back against that? Would you say that was some of the motivation?
And at the same time, this also resonated with our own struggle as writers in terms of, well, how do we go about telling this story, which is not our own story, but certainly needs to be told if people who are, actively engaged in trying to educate themselves around decolonisation and these sorts of politics are missing this. So the whole, then the idea of storytelling and narrative then becomes a theme in the book, and then certain modes of storytelling are employed. You would have picked up that the two main characters are these hapless writers, and then again there's another layer of kind of fictionality in terms of a kind of speculative autofiction, or collective autofiction that is the main narrative vehicle for the book. One of the characters decides that she's, after an encounter and a chance meeting with a poet of Chagosian heritage who calls himself Deigo, but who refuses to share his poems with them, and then leaves them to it and disappears from the book, from the story, to follow his own story. One of the characters, Damaris, then tries to find a way to kind of recuperate or to kind of explore Diego's story through fiction, and then there's this.
I find the way that you both work around fiction really, really powerful. And again, I want to, have us think how can fiction actually keep us on the stakes of something, right? Because on the one hand, we have the colonial fiction that is always there are no use, land is empty, there is nobody there, whatever. Again, that connects it to so many other places. The fact that it's known and it's fabricated and created. And I wanted to connect that actually to what we consider the white books, the white books, but also the non-fiction aspect, or also what we declare as scientific, or what is worth to be in an encyclopedia, or what the British Library promises us, like all the knowledge. And I have to say also, like when teaching international relations, to get to understand how much of that formal information is so fictional to the extent that it's just violent lies, right, and mythological. But then how actually, I think also in my own practice now, trying to think how we can save time by actually engaging arts and engaging the novel and engaging fiction, because it tells us about what matters. And also I think in an era of fake news or not, whatever, like everything becomes so blurry. I'm just talking out loud, but basically that's also, I really would invite everyone to read the book, because it does really push our understanding of what fiction can do in either direction.
Well, Olivia, I was going to ask you a question at this point, and to ask if you could talk more about how we were talking earlier about how looking at fiction, looking at novels with your students, actually, if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so so my own background is like, I'm from Rwandan heritage, but born and raised in Belgium. So we have a lot of stories to exchange about Belgium. And I got into international relations because I wanted to make sense, not just of the genocide that happened in 1949, but also how the international community pulled out on the eve of the genocide, so the UN left. And how, when I went to school, everything that I was taught about the UN, about human rights, about Europe, it had that story didn't add up with my family story, right? So I think it took me a long time. It took me, the students in the audience, it took me 12 years to finish a PhD, because I felt I was chasing information that I did not have access to. Because I wanted to understand, why does the EU not show up? Shouldn't they show up more often, give more money? And so trying to understand that, but not talk about colonialism, that's the thing that in the end just didn't add up anymore, right? And so for me, that I started thinking really about that the traditional canon of international relation as this absolutely violent mythological construction of a reality that never happened or never will happen, which made me then chase this I don't know, this question of like, how should the EU be more ethical in the world? To then end up with the question, like, whenever they show up, it's not that ethical in any way, right? So I have to change the question. So that's what came before, but I think the way to counter it is true that I think now when you have the power in a classroom to have students read stuff, to kind of break through that mythological thing where you say, whatever is an academic article, so because when we write them, we know how it's not fiction, but it's not that good usually. It cannot be the only source of truths or truths that matter. So we need different registers. So I make them watch stuff, read poetry, but myself also with colleagues, I've started to read more novels to think about big international questions, rather than just do the literature review about these really stale, really stale academic conversations we're having, because we're not talking about the world, we're talking about ourselves. Yeah, so that would be my answer. And so that's also, again, why I was so excited to be able to read this, but also for this conversation, because the division between these fiction and nonfiction is not what it should be. But yeah, it can also be easily used for learning purposes. So I think we have to be specific.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think besides the fact that, as Natasha said, we were trained novelists, I think there's something about fiction that allows, I guess, a type of speculation, almost like a space for dreaming. And I think, you know, when we looked at the vast research and written testimony, both from the court records, of which there's a lot, academic monographs, anthropologists who have written about Chagos and worked and lived with these people, documentary film. Yeah. What was somehow missing from all of that was this kind of the question of the unfinished project of return, and the fact that the Chagosian people were still and are still not able to live on their islands. And, you know, actually there was, in the legal records particularly, which are probably the strongest or the most amount of words, I think, if you research the Chagos story, come from the church, the court records. It's actually quite meek what the law allows them to hope for. You know, in none of the court cases, most of which incidentally they've won, you know, like, and repeatedly Britain has been told, no, you must give the islands back, and the facts on the ground.
It's the Queen's Order in Council, which was this instrument that allowed this very undemocratic instrument, which allows the government to overturn a High Court ruling,
right?
Which was employed after 9/11 at the request of the Americans.
Yeah. But anyway, very briefly, in none of the kind of existing literature, let's say, is the question of like, well, what is it to even have a base? You know, what is it to have a military and to spend all this money and I guess have this more hopeful or more what perhaps shamefully sounds like a dream of saying, well, let's do away with military bases, let's return people to their islands and live not, you know, as isolated individuals, but back in their community. And I thought by using fiction, it allowed that kind of space that perhaps in, you know, more factual or academic research, that question wasn't really raised so much.
We'll soon hear another part of the reading, but I wanted to check with the audience if there is any burning questions or comments you have at this point. We would really love to hear from you as well. Go ahead. I don't know if there's is the walking microphone. Yeah. Oh, you have another one.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry to bring back the question to a very basic narrative level. In the extract you read, usually move between the we, the he, and the she, and there's no I at the center. Just wondering if you could be more about that decision.
Thank you. Luke, can I ask you to?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And in fact, we knew we wanted to write together, or we thought we wanted to write together when we were interested in telling a story. But it wasn't until we kind of found the grammatical form via the grammar that you just identified that we felt able to do so. And I think a lot of the narrative emerged from that grammar, which is to say, you know, we were very concerned, we were writing together, but we didn't want to just write a book that sounded as if it could have been written by a single author, almost like, you know, the way, you know, copywriters work for advertising agencies where, you know, there's a team, but they have a kind of unified language. I guess we're getting back to this idea of the fragment, non-unified language. So emerging we wanted, I suppose, the grammar and the book itself to reflect the fact that it was a collaborative project and a collaborative novel. And I think what was really exciting for me, and I don't know quite at what point I came to this understanding, I think we probably came to it before me, it's not that I am writing him and she's writing her and then we're writing together, but it moves even, you know, sometimes she might be writing him and he might be writing her, or she might be writing her, and so on. So there was this kind of fluidity that felt really productive and somehow, spoke to broader issues that, political issues as well as aesthetic issues that we were concerned with.
Thank you for the question. I'd just like to add to that in choosing to write this book together, I had actually written a bit about the history of Chagos in my first novel, but in trying to tell this story, it felt important to tell together and for that kind of collectivity and collaboration to be inscribed within the text because of the nature of the kind of collective struggle of the Chagosians and that there's again, because of foggy brain, I'm going to hand this over to you. But do you remember the question around legal testimony and the kind of experiences and the kind of relationality between the kind of collective experience and the individual experience that somehow we wanted to speak to in the writing? But I will pass to Luke again to.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that for quite a long time, but one really striking thing that we encountered again and again in the legal records, which we read assiduously, was the government defence, which was always the British government lawyers trying to deny that they had acted illegally in removing this population, would undermine the Chagosian testimony when they spoke in court by saying that, by trying to say that your witness statements are unreliable, and they would be trying to be forensic about, what exactly they narrated at what time in what place, and proving, like according to the geography and the map, the literal kind of map that they had drawn themselves, the British Army, that this could not have happened. And, actually Laura Jeffrey, a really wonderful anthropologist and a huge kind of advocate for the Chagosian community, with whom we were also in conversation, writes really beautifully about this and how for those who are testifying, the Chagosians, their interest or even, I guess, matrix of knowledge wasn't wrapped up in the individual experience, but they were determined to talk about it as a collective experience, a collective trauma. And I think that gets back to the idea of Sagram. And I think we might also talk about Sagram as something really inspiring in terms of a kind of collective sadness, as opposed to perhaps the kind of type of melancholic sadness that Western, I guess, psychological discourse revolves around, individualizing grief. So there's this like refusal, I suppose, from the Chagosians to claim that story or that experience as their individual experience, but this was something shared, and only through sharing that experience collectively and then organising collectively might that be overturned. But that was completely anathema to the law, and it is. We know the law functions based on the individual and the individual's right to property ownership. So there was this kind of clash of knowledges that, unfortunately, the law having violence and the monopoly of violence on its side means that the Chagosians are still not there. But in terms of like what it can teach us, and I think how well we educated ourselves trying to understand Sagram was another reason why it felt important to think about the first person plural rather than singular.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, because it's true that when I'm trying to connect the form dots of this novel to political questions, right? Like when I was seeing like, okay, who's talking now, especially in the first part of the book, and the pronouns. And I think it again speaks also to how we produce or reproduce knowledges that are easy to forget, even within the university, for instance, when we talked about this before, where we're always invited to be an individual writer or to say that we came up with something all by ourselves, epiphany, and, the authorial or authoritarian voice that we use in that. But also, again, in teaching, if we were to invite students more often to write papers together without it being clear who speaks when, like it just changes not just the form, but also the buy-in, I guess, to some extent, right? And how it can speak to the politics of what we can do with knowledge. Go ahead.
I was just going to say very briefly, I think it also kind of formalizes what is going on all the time.
Exactly.
Even if like you are writing as an author, as a single authority, like you're always in conversation with other people, other texts, and I think like to deny that is a really weird thing.
It's a fiction.
It's a fiction. Yeah. So kind of like we're always like in dialogue with and indebted to each other and who's come before. So, yeah.
I think I saw another hand. Yeah, go ahead. The microphone will come. Yeah.
So much for yeah, this amazing discussion and the book. My question then be how do we
Closer to you.
can you hear me?
Yeah. Louder.
Yeah. So how do we resolve this contradiction between the fact that you know the law, the legal aspects are what the traders people that resort to, but at the same time, this law is clearly like a colonial law. The law is written by the British. The British civil servants had the power to designate those people as that they are mobile people who don't really and you find in the archives that it says, oh, this is a fiction that we created and maintain. So in a way the law is the law of the colonizer, and yet the colonized have to resort to the ICJ or the law in order to get some of their rights back. So this kind of contradiction, how do we deal with it, and how do we then decolonize the law? How do we? I mean, it's a political question as well. In terms of international relations and so on. So how do you deal with international law, the institutions of international law? How do you decolonize them? Is it even possible? Do we abolish them and start new ones? How do you? Yeah.
Small question. Yeah, thank you. So it also made me think of, but the first time I was actually looking, I followed the whole proceeding of the ICJ because I never do, because who follows the courts, but the case brought by South Africa against Israel, right? So I think Palestine today actually puts us in front of exactly the same questions. We don't believe in ICC, we don't believe in ICJ, but still there's something going on. So I don't actually have an answer to this huge question, but I don't know, also like based on everything that you've been researching and thinking about for this book, like how would you don't have to solve the whole thing.
Possibly more a question for you, Olivia. But I'm glad you bring up Palestine. Interestingly, for anyone who's not aware, the lawyer who spoke for Mauritius at the ICJ, Philippe Sands, now represents Palestine at the ICJ. So that's a very resonant connection there. I don't really have.
I mean, as soon as you mentioned this, I also went straight to Palestine, and I think like I've been following also. I mean, we watched it together actually, Natasha and I, from different countries. But I've been, I guess, learning from the way the Palestinians have talked around what's been going on in the ICJ, and I think Nora Erica, that American Palestinian legal scholar, has been incredibly articulate there. And I think like there's obviously a lot of cynicism about going to the court, the colonizer, and expecting like anything. But she's really amazing, I think, in the way she's saying it's really important like to take on this settler colonial entity from every different angle. And that includes armed resistance, that includes legal wranglings, and to gradually, I don't know, untangle this kind of matrix of, I guess, complicity between the West, particularly America, but obviously Britain being the original colonial power during the Mandate period. And, if the law can do that, it has authority. People respect it, strangely, but they do, perhaps mainstream media and scholars. So if the ICJ says it's a genocide, that is a very powerful rhetorically, if not perhaps legally, because we know and we've seen what happens. It's ignored. So I do think that's a really great parallel. I mean, sometimes I do think, the Chagos situation is really different because it's the Chagosian population are far, fewer individuals than the Palestinian population. But sometimes I have thought that the fact that the Chagosian kind of main resistance has come through the law has been maybe not the best, not the best tactic, but it has meant that there's not been revolutionary demands. There's been certain demands that have been quite weak, and there are different groups. There are radical groups, there are Marxist groups who organise with Chagosians, La Lit, some which we're in conversation with. But I guess majority view is that, you know, we would like to return, and quite neatly, even return to work on the base. That's probably one demand.
That's
yeah.
not
It's not universal,
no.
but the fact that it has been
That's
contained in the law, I think has been problematic in some ways. Yeah, I don't know. I think but thank you for the question.
It's such an important question. Even obviously, you can imagine in the classroom, it also often comes up. Once we deconstruct everything and say everything is colonial, then the question is, okay, what do we do then, right? And you know, Marxism was brought up, but for me, it helps to think, okay, there is stuff that we do or we continue to do pending revolution, however we understand that to be, right? But I think, but like you said, also including thoughts of what also needs abolishing rather than just reform or reinforcement helps us also to, indeed, not just, you know, work with the meager means that we have, but I feel like reading another day.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you. This is a reading that's taken, can you hear me? Yeah, this is a reading that's taken from, again, from the chapter Debt, the opening chapter. It's a scene that is from later in the book, later in the chapter. A bench outside the pub we always went to.
No, it was not
our favourite pub. The sky clear and bright, and the sun hot, but not too hot.
The sadness is always.
The sadness is always, but the listeners tasted just a bit. He'd bought a new lighter, a pack of tubes, 2 pints, and now we were sitting and smoking.
The pub was dead inside.
The pub was dead inside.
Through the window,
yeah, with dust and reflections. We could see the bar person with their squirrel who was sleeping. The picnic bench where we were sitting was dry. None of the slats was missing, like on some benches outside pubs sometimes. And it was stable on its legs too. She helped herself to a third tube. She normally chain smoked while drinking, and he did not object. He was too excited to care. He was poking in his bag, a mumbling coming from the bag, which could have been "Leave me alone," or "I feel great." He emerged, flexed his shoulders. Then he took 2 tubes and tossed one to her. She lit it and held it between her knuckles, then laid her arms flat on the table and leaned forward, resting her cheek on one arm and letting the tube just burn. She said, "What's wrong with you?"
I'm thinking.
About what?
I don't know.
Yes, you do. You're thinking about Adorno.
No, I'm not thinking about anything.
I demand you tell me what you're thinking about. You're not looking yourself these days. Look at me. Do this with your mouth. We looked at one another.
As she opened her mouth.
She opened her mouth wide as if she were afraid.
He didn't move his mouth.
He didn't move his mouth. She smiled with her teeth showing. She closed her lips and furrowed her brow. We continued to look at one another, but he didn't move his mouth or change his expression in any way. A motorbike drove past. A sort of tearing sound. You know what? It's those stupid glasses. Why do you mend them with sugrue? He reached inside his bag and took out Minimum Aurelia and began to read. Did you buy that?
It was a present.
Who from?
The shop.
Carried on reading for several minutes.
All
Clear now, but not like he thought.
The argument
about giving capital. She leaned her arms on the table and rested her cheek on one arm. After a minute, he looked up for the Minimum Aurelia.
It was stupid of me to give Deigo your lighter.
She didn't move or say anything. Just let the tube burn itself out.
He looked at
her hand, then returned to the page. Her tube burnt completely out, and she sat up and threw it under the table. That was Scottish giving.
What?
Scottish giving. It's when you give something away that belongs to someone else.
Huh?
You know, like Indian giving, meaning someone gives you something, then takes it back. You know, white settler colonialists murdering Native Americans and calling it trade.
But I gave
So you're being a Scottish giver.
I
being
gave that
Scottish.
lighter in the first place, though, and I took it to give to someone else, someone who needed it.
We stopped talking and
Stop
sipped
talking
our
and
pint.
sipped our
He
pint.
put minimum Morelia on the table and thought about the
Thought
emergency.
about the emergency.
Then he looked at her
And he looked
and her beady eyes.
Her beady
And he
eyes.
thought about how clever her eyes
He thought
looked,
about how clever-
especially with her green raincoat.
Especially with the green raincoat.
Hey, and what about the block? That's a kind of giving. Not from the shop. I mean, from Adorno. Didn't he write it for his friend's birthday? German giving. A gift that places a burden of reciprocation on the receiver.
Mauritian giving. When you give something with a flourish and a show of great generosity, when it's something you owe anyway.
Like the Chagos Islands. That's what the British would say. Britain says Mauritius gave the Chagos Islands to them, that Mauritius owed them to Britain in exchange for independence. The US thinks it owes Deigo Garcia to the British, but really the British owe the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, who owe it to the Chagosians. Mauritian giving. When you give something great to someone who really doesn't deserve it.
Well, Scottish giving is when the gift is so much greater than the recipient deserves that it dignifies the receiver.
Oh, sounds like Adorno.
Not exactly. Adorno was saying that.
I was kidding, you idiot. No, sorry, tell me. I want to hear.
I don't want to talk about it right now.
She finished her pint.
Finished her pint.
She stretched her arms out in a curious
in a
way,
curious way,
then rubbed the back
rubbed
of
the
her
back
neck.
of her neck. He lit
with
his
the
tube.
tube.
So what about American giving?
Oh, that's when you give something with a huge flourish and lots of pomp, but the gift is shit. Or lethal.
He finished his
He
pint
finished his pint.
and went
Went
inside
inside to
to
order
bar
an awful
person
bar
who
person
was trying to
who was trying to
the
attract
attention of-
attention to the
decrepit
decrepit
pub
pub
dog.
dog.
And in the toilets, he took a piss, then splashed water on his face.
And she picked up Minimum Morelia and read the page he'd been reading, a section called Doctor, that is kind of you, which she thought very good.
And he made a murmuring noise in front of the bathroom mirror and closed his eyes tightly like he'd been staring at a bright light.
And she put Minimum Morelia down and examined the composition of the rubbish below the table, empty packets of Walkers, Snickers, an empty bottle, green, glass with the label peeled off, some tube stubs, all the same brand, the wrapping of a Subway sandwich, a till receipt from Starbucks.
And he thought of the comics whose faces lined the meadows and how unfunny or even tragic they looked collectively.
And she thought about Diego and wondered if all those bags had meant he had arrived from somewhere, or if he had nowhere to go.
And he dried his face, continuing to look into the mirror, his eyes now stinging, wide open, and the water still cold on his skin, and he decided he knew nothing.
And she thought about whether it was bad or good, his habit of stealing bad blocks from chains to leave in shops that sold good blocks, so he could steal good blocks of equivalent financial value from them. The five-finger discount, she thought, and then she thought about how discount can mean not to consider.
And he moved his eyes slowly from the bathroom mirror to the bathroom window, because he'd seen a group of tourists. He could see them now looking up toward the top of the building, and he could see that they were laughing, and their guide was laughing, and fuck it, the sky was laughing too, and so were the open windows of the building. And he tried to think how he could tell her about this.
And she thought that what she should have bought, and she thought that she should have brought a block or bought one from the shop, but she couldn't bring herself to read another one after the one she'd just abandoned, Women as Lovers by Elfriede Jelinek, whose weird Nobel Prize lecture performance remained her favourite of Jelinek's work.
And he thought it wasn't okay, but then he remembered Minimum Morelia and how everything had become clear to him earlier, suddenly, but not the way he'd expected, his hatred of capitalism, it being the very thing preventing him from doing anything whatsoever.
And she thought about an idea for a story, or maybe not. Maybe an essay, but more fictional. And why not a kind of fictive criticism? Or maybe it was just a good title. Factory Girls, an essay comparing Bolaño's Dead Girls from the Maquiladoras and Jelinek Poor Bitches in the Bra Factory, and she thought about the job she had had in the turkey processing plant one summer, and she could never rid herself of the smell of fat, and became vegetarian for 5 weeks, though treacherously she could not remember the first bite of meat that had hooked her back.
And he thought how it was a double bind. But anyway, that was better than this massive amount of hatred blinding him, so that its effects had been a done deal.
And she wondered if she would give him the German gift of a block she had written just for him. He always mocked her for dedicating her first and only published block to her parents, while she mocked him for dedicating his first and only block to her. And she thought about the block she had once bought him for Christmas, a celebration of writerly friendship, which he had taken back to the shop and exchanged for Luke Hampson's Hunger, while his present to her had been a jumper with holes under each arm.
And decided
Thought that what she
he
would
better
give
get
him was
back.
music.
He
Sound
turned
like
from the
Daniel.
mirror
He didn't know
and walked
how
out
to
to
think
the
about
bathroom with a
music.
tenner in his hand
Almost done.
to pay for the
Basically.
pints. But when he got
She
to the
remembered
bar,
playing him.
he saw the bar person had fallen asleep on their stool,
Bird
their head on the
like
bar.
as though he was pecking at the ground, saying it was good music to write to.
And he turned
And
from the
right
bar
to it,
person
he
to
said,
the dog,
She lit
who
another
was
tube,
whining now,
and
but
Dad,
louder,
which was
now he
a
was
bunch who
moving
had drunk
towards
too much, too fast, that smoked too many tubes. And she thought maybe the VU. He only knows the
And as he got close to the dog, it
Sweet
began to tear
She
at the
detected
webbing
in
on
him
the
a great
underside of the bar
acid
person's
knife.
stool.
I wondered if this
But
was
despite this, they didn't
made
wake
her
up.
laugh out loud.
So he put the
Honked
tent
us
on
to
the
the
bar, knelt
Think how
down
outrageous
beside the dog
the
and made a
noise
sucking
And what
sound
is that
with
noise
his
she
teeth
thought?
and
Where he
rubbed
was.
his thumb and
And it
forefinger
was true that
together
he'd loved
until
to
he
learn
got
it,
its full
really.
attention.
Specifically the simultaneous recitations of competing lyrics and contrasting choruses. He'd find
And
it
then it occurred to him that the
and she
model
thought
had
for
the
the very
vibrant
first time
hair
that she had
of
known
a
it
lurcher,
at the BU,
but the
which was
flabby
also the very
flanks
first
of an
time she had
aging
tasted
lamb.
espresso, which was in the bedsit of a busker 10 years older than her, who she'd followed home. A
And he
beautiful
thought,
long-haired
and how
woman
productive
with a
mix that
smile,
was,
who looked
lurcher
at her,
and
sad
dog.
and proud when describing
He had a
how
peculiar
inspired by the
voice,
VU,
not strange
even
when you
what's been
consider his
happening to her.
vegetarianism,
and
but
how some months
perhaps
later,
strange when
she
you
had
consider
forgotten all
what
about
bitterness he had
this
at
woman
times
had
for all
run her
living
up
things, except perhaps
asking
for
for
her.
help, and how she had made an excuse for why she could
He
not
stroked the
leave
dog's
her.
head until he
What does she
calmed
want
it,
from me?
gently
I know
led it
it's
to the
16.
bar,
And how that first
picked up the
song,
tenor
one
and
that
the pints
she
and
had to
returned
ask, "What is
outside
this?"
to the
was
bench,
called
put the
the
pints
hymn.
on the table and sat down opposite.
We looked at one another
as if
as if all the strangeness of the day was not in
not
our
existing.
experience.
So after all,
After all,
often
we also
sidetracked
sidetracked
with
with
not
life
infrequently,
and not
ended up
infrequently
at the
ended
pub.
up at the pub.
They did feel
But the day did feel strange, and in being strange, felt surprising. An instance of insanity or hunger,
hunger,
sanity hunger,
what
what Mahacherith called the house of hunger, where every morsel of sanity
was
was
snatched
from
from
you.
you, the way some kind of bird snatched food from the very mouths
of babes.
of babe.
We picked our pints up and each lit a tube, and after a short pause, he looked at her and said,
Tell me about English giving.
"It's when you give something to someone that really you want for yourself. You English give all the time.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, every block you've ever given me, you wanted to read yourself.
Okay, that's true. No. What about that? Who was it by? That bad kind of autofiction you love to read. Remember in Brussels?
I remember that, but you didn't give that to me. You bought it for me because I didn't have any money.
You never have any money. How come you never have any money?
How come you always have money?"
We
We heard a
have
scratching
sound
sound
and looked up.
and looked up. The dog was
Dog
trying to get out
Was
of the
trying
pub.
to get out.
He got up,
got up,
opened the door,
opened
then
the door,
returned to the bench
to the bench, and she
She
reached
reached
out
out
gently.
and gently stroked its temple. The dog followed, then began sniffing at the rubbish below the table, sticking its muzzle into the bright packets and licking the sugary, coffee-filled salad.
And nudged the
He
dog.
nudged the dog gently with her knee.
The dog moved
The
off,
dog moved off
lay
and
down.
lay down outside the door of the pub.
We
We
sit.
sipped our pints. What were we saying?
I can't remember.
Come on, you do know.
What? I don't.
You don't?
No.
Yes, you do. I want to know. Tell me.
He pretended
He pretended to rummage in his bag
before
before
finding
finding the packet of
the packet
tubes
of
on the
tubes on the
table,
table, then
then lighting another. She looked at his hand, thinking, the way his fingers move ever so
The way
slightly,
the smoke
the way the
rises.
smoke rises without it seeming
She
to
looked
rise.
directly at him.
She looked
just
directly
looked
at
at
him,
her.
but he just looked at her as if some smoked his tube. Okay, in that case, I'll tell you. We were talking about how come you have money and I don't.
It's because my credit rating is better than yours.
That's not hard. Thought we were having a nice time. She took the screen from her pocket.
And turned it on, flashed.
It flashed.
Debt fuckers
Dead
don't
fuckers don't answer.
They'll never find you here.
She turned the screen off and put it in her pocket.
Put our elbows on the
We
table.
put our elbows on the table.
And our heads in our
and our
hands.
heads in our hands.
Faces
Our
close
faces
together.
close together.
If it makes you feel better, I have less money than you. I mean, when you count how much I owe,
Tell me.
I don't know. I know who I owe money to. I have an overdraft from HSBC and another one from Co-op, a handful of student loans, a bank loan I took out when we couldn't pay the rent last year, credit card debt I pass from one card to another whenever they send me an offer. What else? A bike to work scheme loan.
But you lost your job and your bike got stolen.
I know, but I still owe the money. So, as well as what I already told you, let me see, I owe working tax credit because I signed a form too late. Then there's money I owe T-Mobile because I didn't finish my contract before I cut my screen.
It's about Daniel. He must have left there.
Yep, he had a student loan and he owed me, as well as the library at Goldsmiths.
That is strange.
What's strange?
What else but money can you have less than none of?
Wait, I owe even more. There's PayPal and the library, two libraries. Some of that debt was from blocks I borrowed for you. And wait, I haven't included the public debt I'm paying off. I mean, all of us, every poor fucker.
Oh yes, that billboard ticker thing in New York, the national debt clock. The numbers constantly ticking up. I can't remember how much it was when I saw it, but it was a lot. It was, I don't know, it was fucking a massive amount of dollars. And then below the national debt clock, there's another set of numbers also ticking up, but more slowly, and that says your family share in dollars. Diego was standing by his bags outside the library,
blocking
the paper. We said hello, and each picked up some bags. Diego took the rest, and we walked to Sandy Bells from Forest Road. Inside it was hard to hear because there was a fiddle bang, but we talked anyway. We talked about the weather, we talked about the city, we talked about the independence vote, we talked about mountains, and she and Diego talked about Mauritius. We talked about Cartography and Diego from a 19th century popular novel and name for a Portuguese colonial explorer. Though Diego told us that Diego was not his real name, but the name he now chose to go by. We talked sometimes in English and sometimes in French, and then she and Diego talked in Mauritian Creole. We leaned back on the bench and exhaled. We watched our reflections in the window and drank our pints. We bought more pints, one for the bartenders, who we wished was our friend. We talked about boats, we talked about cancer. We exited to smoke tubes. First she and Diego, with him guarding the bags, then him. When we started to talk about tubes, Diego told us about the packs he brought over en route from Mauritius. They're called sportsmen, they're foul and strong smelling. His favourite brand. He has a load in his suitcase. We want to buy some. Okay, we say. We love the name, but we don't know the brand. We decided to look it up on Diego's screen. We watched the best goals of the season. We watched the national debt clock live. We watched piglets being kicked across a pig farm in Kentucky. We watched Stormy singing for Gabler and falling about in the streets in Brussels. But nothing is like the sportsman's tubes. We love the song. We sing it. We buy more pints and drink them. We watch our reflections in the brass trimmed bar. When we run out of money, we sell several packs of Sportsman to Fiddler and buy more pints. Diego points to his bags and tells us what's in each. Tubes, ship plastic toys, codeine, sirens. He talks for 10 minutes about the fake night. Then he asks us what we do. When we tell him we're right, he says, "Have I got a story for you?" We ask about his notebook. What were you writing? Wandering lines, he said. Can we see, she
He
says.
says, and Diego
Diego
says,
says, no, some
colours
colours are not
are
for
not
you.
for you.
We exit to
We
smoke
exit
tubes.
to smoke tubes.
He says
he wishes our friend Deigo was his dad. But
But
Deigo,
Deigo,
says Diego,
he
he
lacks
lacks
the
the
killing
killing
instinct.
instinct.
We take
Cody.
Cody.
He can no longer feel his feet. He doesn't know whether it's because of the codeine or his vegan shoes. Diego says to the fiddler, I'm watching you, and we exit to smoke tubes. Where do you feel you are from? So that there's a question like that, she says. London.
Then says,
But not
London,
you.
but not anymore. And you?
He is the only one who has not spoken these last minutes. He cannot stand straight. He goes to buy a coat from the shop across the road. When he returns, she and Diego are gone. Shit, he says. He drinks the coke, thinks he should eat something, then goes to buy a brew. Feels like having sex with a stranger. He doesn't feel like that anyway, contemplates jumping from a bridge. He explains to himself that really it's best if he goes home. He starts walking.
And she and Diego are holding hands in the toilet at Sandy Bowles. Let's get out of here, she says, and they stow the bags under their bench, then exit Sandy Bowles.
And he is walking off too. He can't feel his feet. The world is colourful. Things go on and on.
And she's thinking that's what's so sad about anything, and how he'd said nothing's worth anything in the end, and how she'd said that's not true. There's got to be something worth something, and how he'd said, do you have a point here at all? Do you? Do you?
Before how bad I am at timekeeping, and I thought we had like so much time left. It's already 8. Amazing. So, in what you just read, there is so much there, and I put like keywords like hunger, and then the giving, that some poems are not meant for you. And I think the question I want to ask, and I mentioned these bullet points because you're free to actually pick up on anything else, but I was struck by, and we've spoken before a little bit about the non-individual nature of what comes out, both in the struggles, but also I think in how you formatted the writing of this, but also how you just performed it, right? I think it really, I finally also just realized why the 2 columns, like it's things happening at the same time, because I was reading it. And I want to ask about I don't know if it's a centrality, but that's how I felt it. But I want to come back to the sadness and the Shanghai specifically. I heard about it before when I was reading about Haiti, but I think I almost viscerally felt it as it's a political sadness, but the way you bring it in the novel is also a very individual, family, and other stories sadness that comes there, right? So what would you want to share about the role of, and I'm not going to say even in general emotions, but I guess also in many directions, how do we place deep sadness? I think that is also part of some of the political questions we're trying to address here. So that's my, I think, kind of not final question, but that's the question I have from this bit. But I will open it up later on after your first reflections to the audience. So we will have still a chunk of time, but it would be really nice to just collect people's ideas, comments, questions. So yeah, not to end on a happy note, but I was really struck by it because I recognized it so deeply. But it comes at different levels. So
Do you want to say? Okay. It is, in a sense, it's not ending on a happy note, but I also think the way that the sadness, as we understood it through engaging with the concept of Sagran, which is a Chagosian Creole word, so it's unique to not just Creole, but Chagosian's Creole, felt hopeful, actually. And I think it kind of points maybe to something that we briefly talked about earlier, of the way the different types of sadnesses in the novel are configured. So the two characters, as you probably heard, well, especially when Natasha was reading from the first few pages of the book, are listless, they're sad, they have the sense of the sadness, but what they're encountering is that's quite an isolating feeling. Even though they're both sad, they feel sad in their individual ways, and it leads to a kind of debilitating sadness. And I think one of the, I guess, movements in the book is understanding sadness not as something in terms of melancholy, which is that inward looking type of sadness, but a sense of collective sadness that links all of us. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to add to that. Thank you for asking us to reflect on this. I think it's important to mention not just narratively, but sort of thematically with the book, that actually the sadness that the characters are experiencing is grief. They're bereaved because Oliver, Pablo's brother, who was part of their community as well, so a friend or frenemy of Damaris' character as well, died by suicide. This character, Daniel, that first section is called Diego and Daniel. Daniel died by suicide, and it was a kind of a death of desperation, and someone who's politically engaged, but allowed himself to, no, not allowed himself, but was defeated, had individual, was experiencing this political desperation individually, was unable for many reasons, not least the structures of the society that he's living in, to
Also whiteness,
yeah, to kind of connect with others and see beyond his own sadness, and the kind of resonance, that there is a resonance with Zagreb in terms of I guess there's a we were trying to make this connection with Zagreb as a political death. Now my brain is fogged, and I wondered if you could talk about that document that we've tried to find that we never found, which Chagosian activists, when the Chagosian community were expelled from the Chagos Islands, families and communities were broken up. Some people were left dumped in the Seychelles, others in Mauritius. People were in absolute shock, absolute disbelief. Many people died by suicide. Some people died en route, just being on the boat. From some died by suicide, and some had heart attacks. But what was really important to the Chagosians was that these deaths were documented as being a direct result of this expulsion and the state violence that of British government.
So the document that Natasha's referring to is a document that we know exists or had existed because we read about it, referenced in
The academics, David
Vine had it at one point, but it was a document where a sociologist, I think a nun who was also a sociologist, was employed by the British to kind of, I guess, try and fact find why so many Chagosian people were dying and were living in poverty, even though this perhaps goes back to what you're saying, like, we know exactly why, but that wasn't perhaps recognised by the British. And so she interviewed lots of Chagosian people and then wrote on the document, so-and-so died by suicide, died by drunkenness, drug use. And the Chagosian community responded to this document by denying, saying, no, this is wrong. They died of Zagreb, by sadness. So they refused this individualization and pathologizing of their,
collective
That
experience. of
publicly
collective
and said
trauma.
that this was because of this deracination, and to this day, that's what they insist on, and I think that's where a lot of the strength comes from, and the hope, yeah.
Yeah, I find that so powerful because even just the what seems like a trivial attempt to get to the library, it didn't make me laugh, but it's so recognizable how we have so many things we actually want to do in this life, but there is a tiredness, sluggishness, a grief that also accompanies, I think, many of us, and the fact that it's various characters that carry this is so powerful because grief is, I think, always political to some extent, but then some of us are socialized to see it in a medicalized individual way, which sometimes is useful, I guess, but there is a lack of conversation about how so many colonized people die of the same things somehow, right? Like, so how do we not collectivize it? So, but then also I think there is a saga in our white world order, in white societies as well, right? That we again are not able to recognize. So I find that a very powerful way of connecting again some of the really important dots. There's no end to this sentence. I'm gonna open it up. I'm gonna open it up to the floor. We have and I don't know who to look at the organizer, but let's say 15 minutes, and then we have a closing reading. Yeah, very short one. Yeah. Again, I want to open it up to any questions, comments you might have, things you want to share. Go ahead. So we have someone in the back, and then someone. Do you want to collect someone?
Yes, I see.
So we'll take 3 questions. I already have 2. So one more person if you want to raise your hand, but go ahead in the meantime. Yes.
Having considered for to involve the field into the dialogue with the Diego, because it's not just people moving, it's culture and language and other aspects that go with when people are displaced and the identities are created. So I was fascinated today here that you had a conversation with him in Creole and in English and French. So could you say a little bit more about the Creole aspect of it? Just in my own perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have another question here. So another question, maybe.
So thank you, Natasha, that's really interesting. I'm just wondering if you could speak to some of the things that I noted of kind of the tension between sort of truth, radicalism, and sort of personal safety or comfort or detachment from the sort of violence that was experienced, that has been experienced by the Chagosians. Yeah, just how those sort of those tensions, you feel them as academics, as researchers, as authors.
Thank you for those questions. The conversations with so what happens at the end of that last scene that we read is that Damaris and Diego go off for a night of drinking and talking, and then later on in the book she discovers recordings on her phone of these conversations, and she starts to transcribe them. And these are conversations that she's not a fluent Creole speaker, but the more she drinks, the more fluent she thinks she is. But she understands it fluently. but there's a certain kind of mode of being that she feels able to inhabit in the context of Creole. I should say, from my personal experience, yeah, I can only talk about, I can't talk about Diego's Creole. That's some, well, I'll talk about my Creole first and then I'll talk about Diego's Creole. But basically, so my first language was Mauritian Creole up until the age of about 4 or 5. My parents were very young when they had me. They were very new immigrants to the UK, and they had left school quite early on. And the teacher, my teacher told my parents to stop speaking Creole to me because it would confuse me because I didn't speak any English. And they followed the teacher's advice, and I lost my Creole. But I, and because it's very expensive to fly to Mauritius, we never went to Mauritius as a family. I grew up pre-internet. I never had access. I only had access to Mauritius through the kind of memories of my family and the language of my family, and I understood Creole fluently. A family member came to visit us, and I took the day off work to hang out with him, but he spoke no English. But by the end of the day, I could speak Creole. Well, it was very basic. It was Mauritian, and I should make a distinction. It's Mauritian Creole because there's Rodrigue Creole, there's Aganega Creole, and there's Chagosian Creole. Now, Diego's Creole, Mauritian Creole, we don't know the story about how he acquires his Mauritian Creole, or we don't know the story of whether he speaks Chagosian Creole, whether he lost his Chagosian Creole. But in the book, the character Dallas tries to kind of propose a story around this also. But it's this idea of losing language. But for me personally, I do feel that somehow this early loss of Creole is actually how I became a writer. Somehow, I don't know, that I've been writing around this absence.
Just very quickly though, and later in the book, we, I guess, transcribed a type of transcription from some documentary films that are really incredible. Yeah. And there, you know, a lot of the people who are speaking there are speaking Chagosian Creole, and it's translated actually in the film into French, and then it's English subtitles. But there were moments in our transcription of the film into the book where I think it was more your decision.
There were some moments of Mauritian Creole as well.
As well.
Yes.
But
yeah.
when we decided, and I was really guided by Natasha's Creole speaker, to not translate that to English, and just so there are moments where there's Creole just in there.
Yes. Yeah.
And that felt important too.
In terms of making space for the voices of others, but also yeah.
Sorry, carry on. I was going to say something, but I'll say in a minute.
But that was important because it was because we were transcribing from film. This is a kind of the kind of the actual voice that we're hearing, right, rather than kind of the voice that you hear in court as well, and so there's different kind of voices and modes of speaking.
But if I understand right, the moments where you chose not to translate that Creole into English were that when you felt that Creole was kind of untranslatable, which is to say, like they were saying
and
something.
not translated by me.
By you. Yeah. So just to allow it.
Yeah.
And there was some French in there as well, right?
Yes.
Like, and I think I really like the question while you were talking about the advice teachers gave your parents. Again, just to underscore how copy-paste all these colonial stories are. I also was born in a random family in Brussels, and I have no kin around that, let's say, but it's the same reason, you know, for the good of your children, you should only speak French to them. And again, today also we have so many students who have all these other languages, they would never put that on their CV or something like that, but even not having it So yeah, maybe that's an encouragement to actually be a writer, to say like, let's go and look for what we lost. So thank you so much. Do you have, yeah, go ahead.
Could you repeat your question? I think I got a little bit lost with the Creole answer. Sorry.
So, yeah, the sort of themes, the sort of tension between sort of truth and the radicalism, and sort of general sense of the safety, comfort, or detachment of researchers, academics, authors, especially when you're dealing with sort of colonial violence.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't have a direct answer, but I think it's...
Can I try and see if I can speak to your question? Yes, there is a tension, and there is I think it was that's a tension that actually this book took 10 years to write. It took us 10 years to write because we had to figure out how to write it, and we had to, because we were conscious of our position and this position of safety and comfort, and how and whether or not we should write it, in fact. And all I can say, and this isn't a way to pitch the book, I feel that in writing the book, we were trying to the book tries to negotiate these tensions, and it tries to take account of our respective positions in relation to the Chagosians' story. You know, we are not Chagosian. It's not our story, and yet we have a duty to listen to this story, and to, if we have the means. I mean, yesterday, Luke, who teaches at Birkbeck, chairs an event with Sarona Abouakar, the Palestinian poet, who I'll read from after, and the activist Amy Sharan, about literature and revolution in relation to Palestine. And one of the students asked a question. They were really grateful and appreciative to have heard from Amy and Sarona, and the student said, "But what can we do? We want to do something. What can we do?" And Sarona, who is part of an organisation called Makan, which is a transformative Palestinian-led educational outreach organisation, which tries to educate people around Palestine to be able to kind of step up as allies and supporters. I'll see if I can remember her formulation, but to do what you can with what you have.
Yeah, with the resources.
With the resources you have.
In the location.
In the where you are at this moment. And start, this book was our attempt to do that in relation to the violence that the Chagosian people still experience. So, okay. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think like now I can answer your question. Yeah, I think like one of the things that we were thinking about a lot in writing this book was perhaps to pick up on your kind of word of tension, was a tension that exists in the novelistic tradition that we were interested in exploring between empathy and solidarity. And I think what Natasha and I perhaps kept on hearing from novelists, many of whom we really respected and liked, was that somehow like novels or narrative promotes empathy, and somehow magically, if you just read lots of novels, you'll stop being somehow that was congealed for us in a moment that I think we were watching TV. I was around with yours, or you were around anyway when 9/11 happened. Like we were in Norwich at the time. Anyway, Ian McEwan very quickly, as he tends to do, writes a piece in the Guardian about 9/11, which many of you might have read at the time, but it's quite shocking to return to it, because it seems to me, just concludes that if the people who had driven the planes into the buildings had just read more novels, and perhaps novels by New Kewen, they might not have done it because they would have had empathy for the West. And we were like, well, if all these novelists are saying something and everyone's saying the same thing about empathy, is that like maybe we need to scratch at that? So I think we were thinking about solidarity as perhaps a different mode of writing the novel, and the novel as an act of solidarity and what that might mean. And I think there are lots of implications for that, like not just writing a novel and then just saying, oh, well, we told the Chagosian story, but like maintaining relationships with the community, and I guess a mode of writing alongside rather than for or with. Yeah.
I think you mentioned speaking nearby.
Yeah, this was
That
really
was
important.
yeah. No, such a powerful question, because I've also been thinking about this again, also in because you mentioned also, you know, other academics are in the classroom, and especially the relationship to truth, right? And I think I don't want to be super relativist when I teach, but I also caution for the type of neoliberal scientific truths that we are attached to. There's something else. There's other types of political truths that I think circulate in this, but it makes it uncomfortable. But I guess for me, at least, just example of how you two are speaking at the same time, or in the novel, there's not the I, but I think it helps us think that not that there's many truths and everything goes, but again, that it's something multiple. And then what comes out of that, and it is required, I think, for solidarity. The discomforts, yeah, I wanted to give that example because also we have been speaking about Palestine and how difficult it's been, I think, to teach since, I mean, it's been difficult to teach decolonial stuff properly for the longest time, but I think October 7 did something specifically in this country where it's literally criminalized, right? And so I had my head of department saying, oh, I know you're a good teacher, and we, you know, all appreciate it, but I have a duty to tell you this. And there was a student who had said that they felt uncomfortable in class. And I was like, okay, if that's the message, we're doing our job, because you cannot teach either sociology, human rights, or whatever at times of genocide, but in general, where we all sit in our comfort, I think. So I really appreciate you bringing that, because often we want to settle these things, but that's a violence, I would say, in and of itself. I was not supposed to answer this, but
Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions, and that's about it, I think. Or even if you have a comment, something you want to share. Emma, go ahead.
So I'm very curious as to how you managed to write together. How can you throw light on this process of authoring a novel, and this idea of writing a novel as solidarity, as an act of solidarity, it's like some kind of epiphany that, you know, came upon me when you mentioned it. So maybe you can, write about the socializing this creative process.
Just
Yes, yeah. I would like to answer that, and then I would like you to talk about kind of funny.
Okay.
About the idea of the novel as an act of solidarity, or the answer it took. That's partly the reason why it took so long as well to write because we were writing together. It's a difficult process. Yeah, it was a really difficult process. But also, I think it's important to say that the collaboration and the process extended beyond the actual writing and the words, but also the kind of the labour and the care that could allow and make that space for the writing. We each have families and children, and in the holidays we try to kind of get together in one place, and one of us would write actually at this time also, because the the bereavement that happens in the book is one that Luke experienced himself personally and didn't always feel able to write. But Luke's an amazing cook and he's really, really amazing with kids. Me, not so much. So, you know, the collaboration in parts also was about Luke kind of looking after everyone while I kind of shut myself away and wrote. And, you know, it's a kind of, but this socializing is a beautiful way of formulating it. And it's something that we would actually, to the point actually as well, where when you say, Luke, you know, it's not as though we've written this novel and then that's it. It's, we want the book to be an opening up to allow for conversations and to allow for kind of other modes of solidarity to, you know, be enacted. Like, for example, what you're doing at Birkbeck with the
Sanctuary scholars.
sanctuary scholarships and things that keep happening. Anyway, yeah. Do you want to say?
I don't think I've got anything to add. I would say the only thing is that was probably one of the really big discoveries in writing the book together, is that it wasn't just about, well, writing is not just about being on your own in a room, like trying to like channel something inside you and express it, but it's something that emerges through conversation. And like there were lots of different ways we wrote it. Like sometimes we were literally writing on the same laptop. Sometimes we would write a couple of sentences past the other. Sometimes we're in different countries and we'd write emails. Sometimes we would record our conversations and transcribe them. So there were lots of different ways that it came, but I do think it almost felt like it emerged through, yeah, a social situation of our friendship, I suppose. Yeah, and different, and that feels a little liberating as a writer, I think, or it did for me.
And in a way, we were very guided by Moten and Harney's collaboration and the way that they kind of, you know, Moten says that it's not that he's necessarily working on 5 or 6 projects so much as working in active conversation with 5 or 6 people that he's always thinking.
Larger projects.
Yeah. And you're still friends.
Before I give you the floor to end us with the poem, I just wanted to thank both of you. First of all, for the book. As I said, I'm going to read it again. And I'm also just grateful to be able, like you say, the way of socializing this, that you can actually share this also, you know, with friends, but also in the classroom. Yeah, that's for me personally. I'm very grateful for that. I thank you for this conversation, and also thank you everyone for their presence, but also the questions that you had, and for the organizers for having us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks, Olivia.
Thank you, Olivia. Solidarity with Palestine, Palestinians, and for our friend Serena Abwaka, who wrote this beautiful collection of poetry, which was published by the 87 Press in 2021. I'd like to, I would really like to end tonight with a reading of one of her poems. What's the page? It's a very short poem, and it also, Serena is one of the people that we are in conversation with, because it's not, this book also is emerged out of conversation, but not just a conversation with one another, but with a wider group of friends, and also how kind of continuing thinking around his. The poem was called Debt. Debt. Set up a trap for debt collectors. Welcome them to come to your front door. Drop a safe on their heads so they can feel the weight of what you are overdue.